kidding. I should stop kidding. People probably take that seriously. Place to start. So today's lecture, camera and sensors. All that other blah is just blah, but it's really about cameras and sensors. It's really about sensors, but they come in cameras, so I include cameras in the title. Big duh here, camera's important, but it's important because it is the single most important piece of equipment in the chain. The thing to remember with the camera choice, the decisions made at the camera end is that those decisions will follow you / haunt you right to the end of the project. So whatever decisions you make about things like sensor size, so even, I guess let's even back it up a step. The decisions you make about camera choice can and will affect you all the way down the chain. For example, you decide to shoot on one of the school's Panasonic cameras, and you're gonna do all your B-roll on a GoPro that you have in your pocket or wherever. Those two sensors operate quite differently and have everything from different colorimetry to different sensitivity to, yada, yada, yada. They're different. So when you go to try and match those cameras in post, it's gonna be obvious when you cut from one camera to the other because the two cameras perform differently. In reality, well, I shouldn't say in reality, in the industry, you try to match all your cameras so that you have the same camera multiple times. If you have a B-roll camera, it's the same camera as your A camera, just because it makes it so much easier in post. This is not to say you can't fix things in post, you certainly can, but the challenge is, do you want to, right? A simple choice at the beginning can save you sometimes hours, depending on the complexity of the matching, days, and sometimes minutes, let's be fair. I mean, there's lots of presets now that you can get that are quote unquote good enough, right? And I don't know why I just did air quotes because you're looking at the slide and not me. But anyway, so keep that in mind, that the decisions you make, one of the things that I always caution students about, and I know sometimes it's a bit esoteric, is that when you're starting out, you always just sort of, what's good enough? I just need to get a picture and I need to get sound. And that's a fair comment. No one should feel kind of badly that they don't have all the right gear. Nowadays, as you know, you can shoot things on your phone. There's all kinds of sources for material that aren't traditional, quote unquote, professional. But at the same time, you've got to think in the back of your mind that you are compromising. So know that you're compromising, be fine with it, but know that when you get the chance, you're going to match, for example, your A-roll and B-roll cameras, if possible, right? So that's what I mean by saying choice is made at the camera end. I mean, there's a whole entire lecture really on sort of prepping your cameras, and we're not at that level here. Today, we're going to talk about sensors, but I just want to underline the fact that, don't just think that all cameras act the same way, that all you have to do is set the same, for example, pick the same frame rate and start shooting. You're going to get, when you get into the level of fine editing and fine post, you're going to start seeing color differences, framing differences. You're going to see lens distortion, back to my GoPro example. GoPros distort intentionally because they're wide angle lenses in order to overcome other issues with them. And you can, again, there are presets, there are lens presets in various pieces of software to fix that, but even the preset is going to make it look different than the original, right? So, okay. The camera itself, the camera body. So the camera itself, when we talk about a camera, we're talking about the sensor housing nowadays. And I say nowadays because it's a relatively recent development over the last 10 or so years that we've ended up with this box with a sensor in it, and we call it the camera. The camera used to be this. It used to have all this apparatus on it. Now, you could add and subtract and modify, but this was essentially the base camera back in the day. And in some cases, it still is. You'll see this Arri camera, some of the stuff doesn't come off. The lens comes off, the viewfinder comes off, the wireless pack, half of it comes off and the rest of it stays on, right? So all that stuff is the camera. But today, we're moving to an era now where everything's modular, and good and bad. It's good because it gives you the flexibility to make all kinds of choices. You can have this sensor, that lens mount, this lens, on and on and on. You can essentially build a custom camera that suits your needs. The bad news is, as you have with all these choices, is there's all those choices. And you can bog yourself down in trying to match everything perfectly and get all the right stuff, right? So keep that in mind as well, that although you have the choices, so I like using car metaphors because cars are kind of the same idea. There's some models of automobile, and Honda is a good example. Not that I'm trying to push Honda, but Honda has basically 2 or 3 models of like the Civic. You can get the base Civic, you can get the midline Civic, you can get the performance Civic, and of course, if you got a lot of money, you can get the Civic R. So there's 4. But within those models, you buy the midline Civic or the Civic Si performance model, you don't get a lot of options to choose from. It comes kind of as is, right? So that's Honda. You look at, say, well, Porsche is a good example of this, where you buy a Porsche Macan, to say the SUV, and you have a menu of choices. You can get the wheels customized, the steering wheel customized. You can get different engines, different, tons of different stuff. Well, the problem with that is you have to make all those choices, and sometimes they can be confusing. Sometimes you make the wrong combinations. Sometimes, I mean, they have software now when you buy a car. If you click on something that doesn't match what you've already picked, it says you have to delete all the other stuff to get this stuff, right? Well, the same is true with cameras. If you have all this modularity, it is really flexible, but with that flexibility comes complexity, and that can just really bog people down. So just, again, a bit of an industry tip more than a lesson on how cameras work. Okay. What's the essence of the camera? The essence of the camera, you can actually see it in this shot, and oh yay, I finally decided and remembered to increase my cursor size. You can see the sensor in the middle here of the shot, and that is the device that picks up the light. It's the imaging device, sometimes called an imaging sensor, and it converts the light into electric energy, right? So they're solid state, which means there's no moving parts, which, in case anyone didn't know, that's what solid state means. There's no moving parts. It's not to say that, I mean, film cameras had moving parts because there was film. Old style analog cameras had tubes. They were also solid state, nothing moved, but they weren't considered solid state until transistors came along, just so you know. There is a row of a great many light sensitive pixels. I purposely didn't put a number there because that number varies depending on the various technologies that they're using. So the first thing is there's resolution. So resolution will define the minimum number of pixel sensors you need, right? So a 1920 by 1080, for example, 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels, multiply those two together, that's the total number. But there's also such things as subpixels. So you multiply that total number by 3 to get your subpixels for color. You can then have pixels, you can have sensors that are designed to overscan. So you shoot in 5K, but you get a 4K result, et cetera, right? So that's why I didn't say a particular number of pixels. They're just a great many. And they're in the millions in some cases. So yeah, the number of type determine the resolution. So 1 chip or 3 chips? Well, 3 chip cameras are sort of going by the way of the dinosaur, but they still have purposes and they still have value. So it's worth mentioning. And in fact, some of the higher end stuff is still using the 3 chip process. Why that is because, and we'll get into that in a bit more detail in a minute, that 3 chip cameras split the light into the 3 colors. But that means that you have 3 chips, the entire resolution of that chip is getting that 1 color, which means you have more color information, more detail, right, than a 1 chip camera. And that's a fact, but with that 3 chip camera comes more bulk, so you have to have an optical way to divide up the light. It's called an optical block. All kinds of extra hardware involved. They're bigger, right? They're just physically bigger. So you couldn't, for example, have a 3 chip camera in your phone. There'd be nowhere to squeeze in all the prisms and stuff you'd need to split the light up, right? And when I say prisms, here's kind of an example of what's happening. So if we look at this diagram here, you can see the rear of the zoom lens. Remember the optical axis, AKA the optical center of the image. And then you've got these prism arrays. And so where you see the dashed lines is where the light travels and how it's split. So let's just give you a quick one here. Light comes from the back of the zoom lens, runs through the first prism, reflects off this prism, right? It's a red there's reflecting mirrors. It's called a blue reflecting dichroic mirror. It means it reflects only blue light. So light hits this, bounces off the mirror, reflects internally in the prism. Prisms are designed to reflect light internally, right? This is not a mirror on this side, it's just glass, but the way the glass is cut, all the blue light bounces into the blue sensor, right? And then same is true here, red reflecting mirror here, only the red light bounces back, hits the glass, bang, and then green goes to the, so that's kind of how the light is split. But what that means is each one of these sensors has full resolution of that 1 color, right? So as you can imagine, it's the most data you could probably get. But you can imagine this area here, this optical, they call it optical block, is pretty bulky. So what we've decided on instead, for a number of reasons, and one of the reasons is power consumption. Understand that 3 chips means 3 times the amount of power required for those chips. Well, that's not exactly true, but more or less. We've gone to a 1-chip system. And what we do with a 1-chip, and you can see on this illustration here, on this 1-chip, we have what's called a filter. And the filter is, in this case, a Bayer filter. We'll talk about those momentarily. And instead of dividing the light up with the prisms that we saw back here, instead what happens is individual pixels on the resolution are assigned specific colors. So right away you can realize that not all the pixels are getting all the colors, right? We're going to recreate this image in processing after we captured it. Okay. So do I start? Hang on a second. Let me just stop the pause of recording. Come on. Zoom. Here we go. Pause recording. Share screen. Okay, so where were we? All right, so when I say, let's go back here. Let's remember where we are. Right, so 1-chip filter. So here's the filter. And this is obviously an exaggerated illustration, but the pattern of the filter is exactly correct. This is a Bayer filter. There's a number of other filters that are used, but the Bayer filter is by and large the most common filter. Bayer is a fellow who designed and invented this idea of using multiple adjacent pixels to recreate a color image, right? And again, I'll explain more of this as we go. So one of the things you'll notice about this right away is there's more green cells than all the other colors, right? There's more green than red, there's more green than blue. There's equal amount of red and blue, but there's more green than each of the other colors, right? So one of the reasons that is because they've used the green pixels to not only show you the green, but also to measure the brightness of the image, of the area of the image, right? So that's, and again, we'll explain that, so don't worry to have to, here's a breakdown here of kind of how the turf is on the cell on the filter is done. So if you imagine this filter is sitting on top of a sensor, and I've got an illustration there. So if you imagine this on the left here is a sensor array, and each one of these photo sites are getting light, then that's what the filter is doing. So we're going to go back here. So we have green. Some of the green cells are detecting green, and then blue and red, and then some of the green cells where it says P, these are actually green color. These are green color, right? But they say P. I don't know why it says P in this illustration, but it's the brightness, it's the contrast. So with all the P cells calculated, and this is the way it works in the camera, you capture all this light, you take all these P cells, that does a bunch of math to recreate the gaps, right? You see all this bunch of missing gaps here, and then you come up with a black and white image. And then on the other side of the calculation, you take all the R, G, and B, and you do a similar kind of checkerboarding, although a different pattern slightly, and you get a color separation of the 3 colors, and then you marry that together and get a color image. All this is going on inside the camera. The sensor gives off the data, right? So when we talk about raw, and we'll talk about raw later on, raw is right off of this, right? None of this calculation, none of this other black and white and color separation calculation has been done. So when you talk about a raw image, that's what you're getting, right? Okay. So one thing I'm going to do is sort of reinforce the idea with you that pixels in their native state only detect light. They don't detect color. They don't detect frequency. They only detect quantity of photons, right? What the filter does, and again, we'll explain this more as we go, what the filter does is it removes lights of certain frequency so that the measurement then is just that light that passes through. And that's how we know what the color is. The pixel itself, it's still seeing a monochrome image, right? And I'll get back to that in a second. So the downside to 1-chip, there's visible errors and artifacts in them. There's aliasing, there's moire, and there's what's called false color. You can imagine this calculation back here that I'm showing on the bottom row. If it goes wrong in any way, you can get all kinds of colors that aren't correct because, of course, some of these pixels aren't being recorded. So wherever there's a gap in this pattern, the color of that pixel has to be estimated, right? And we'll talk about that again as we go here. So, but what about color? Okay, so I wonder if this is where I should show the video. Maybe I'll show the video here. Hang on. So let me just stop share. Go to here. Go to here. All right. So let's do this. And I hope this is the right place for this. It's been a while since I've done this on. I've never done this online. So let's try this. Let's go here. Share sound. And
from a conventional CMOS sensor, we'll see 5 layers: a micro lens, color filter, an inner lens, a wiring layer, and the photodiode.
so, we'll get back to this construction issue in a second, and we'll probably come back to this video as well. But this is kind of how the layers of a sensor are put together. What we're concerning ourselves with here is the photodiode and pixel portion, right? So let's just.
In a Sony CMOS sensor with export technology,
Sony CMOS.
There are many optimizations done, including an increase in photodiode size and a reduction of thickness in the wiring layer. This gives the light a greater area to collect while reducing any possible obstruction.
I'm going to turn him off for just a second. I want to show you the animation. That's why I want to show this to you now. So if you look at the animation, you see the pixels dropping into the columns, right? The pixels that are coming in are all colors, right? This is all before the filter. They come in, they're all colors. Oh, hang on, let's go back. And what the filter is doing, which is this layer up here, and this layer up here, depending on which of these two you're looking at, is it eliminates the photons that aren't the color you want, right? So all that ends up landing on the sensor is that color. So the sensor's only getting one color, right? In this case, it doesn't know that it's green. It just knows that there's X number of pixels. The camera knows that it's green because it knows what color has been assigned to that pixel, but the pixel itself doesn't have any idea. It just knows that it's getting so many photons, and then later on the calculation is done, right? And why this is important is because, we'll just go back to here. This is important because pixels are monochrome. All this calculation takes time and power, right? It's not a matter of that the pixel is capturing reality, right? The reality is being reconstructed. So when you decide to go with raw, that reconstruction isn't happening in the camera. It's happening in post. You're doing it, right? The raw data does not include that filtering data. You get all the pixels, you get all the information from the camera, but the calculation hasn't been done to turn it back into a color image. So if you look at a raw image, and if any of you have seen a raw image, you'll notice that it's pretty washed out, if at all colored, depending on the raw. There's a whole bunch of different raws, right? So the pixels are assessing how much light's falling on them, right? So here we go. Here's the photosite array, which is a fancy term of saying the individual pixel sensors. And then the photons drop into these buckets, right? And they all drop in, and all that's happening when the photons hit these sensors in your camera, the individual pixels, is there's a count happening. And that count is very straightforward. 4, 5, 6, 1, 3. It doesn't count red, green, blue at all, right? Because camera sensors don't do that. We have to put a filter on top. So we do, right? So we put a filter on top. Now you can see that the count will be only the red. So if there's 9 photons dropping in and 3 of them are red, this pixel is going to say, I have 3. This pixel is going to say, I have 3 green. This pixel is going to say, I have 3 blue. The camera, when I say the camera, the processor and software in the camera knows that this pixel is only supposed to collect red. Therefore, when it does the calculation, that 3 becomes 3 red. This 3 becomes 3 green. This 3 becomes 3 blue. Okay? Questions? I'm going to pause. Okay. So the Bayer filter, right? Bayer was an inventor at, I think it was Kodak. Kodak made the first digital camera, which is ironic because digital cameras put Kodak out of business because they couldn't capitalize on it. So that's a little lesson, by the way, in falling in love with an idea. Kodak was a film company. They developed a digital camera. They actually marketed it for a little while, but they felt that it was a threat. They didn't feel it was a threat. They didn't see a future in it. They figured the future was in improving film, and how wrong they were, right? They're now almost out of business. If I don't even know if they exist at all, actually. But anyway, someone there invented this array, and it's an array of red, blue, and green pixels, and it sits over top of the sensor. Okay, you could literally peel these off. Back in the day, nowadays they're attached in a better way, but in the old days, you could actually peel off this plastic layer on top of the pixel. And so the other reason, by the way, that we have more green than red and blue is because the human eye is more sensitive to green than red and blue, which is also why we can use the green data for brightness, because as we know, the human eye is more sensitive to brightness than color, right? So we can make compromises in color. We can fool the brain with color. We can't fool the brain so much with brightness. Yeah, and I guess so the reason we don't have equal number of colors is because there'd be more noise in the image, right? By doing it this way and doing the proper calculation, we can actually get a cleaner image. So again, this is just to repeat the Bayer mosaic. So you get this, you start off with the initial pattern, this is the initial filter. You have a bunch of calculations. Wherever you see a question mark, there's a calculation that has to be done for that channel, right? So red, green, blue, right? And then you get here, let's have a look at the image before and after it's converted. So here, and it's hard to see, the image on the left, sorry for the bad resolution, because I could not find an image of a high enough resolution, but actually it works in a way. The image on the left is the final result. It's a bit pixelated because it's blown up a bit, but it helps us see the individual pixels, but it's proper color, right? The image on the right is the image before what's called debayering. This is the image off the chip. Okay. So light has passed through the sensor onto the filter, or through the filter onto the sensor and been recorded in this pattern. All right. Questions? No?
What part does the math?
What part does the math? Oh, well, the camera does the math. So,
What part of the camera does the math?
well, there's a processor in the camera. There's a CPU in the camera, and it calculates all the different things that have to be calculated. So this is one of the reasons, by the way, cameras eat batteries big time, because as we get more sophisticated and we play more tricks with the image, so I'll pause there for a second. Sensor technology is moving fairly linearly and fairly slowly. I mean, there's been improvements in sensors, but it's not huge. What the big changes are and why we're getting better and better cameras is because the calculations and the processing in the camera, along with processing in computers, is getting more sophisticated and faster and better. So we can play more tricks with less data. You follow me? So you can make a sensor that doesn't give you a complete picture, but you can put a really powerful computer in that camera, right? The problem with that is, A, the camera gets super hot. Like some of these red cameras, some of the high-end Arri cameras need cooling fans running all the time. It's a bit of a pain in the butt. But at the same time, you can now do really powerful calculations and have some really nice imagery in the camera. The downside is that takes time, and some of the higher end cameras can get a bit what's called laggy, in that it can be a couple of milliseconds before the actual image is recorded. Not a big deal for you and I, but for some people that's a bit of a problem. But there are computers in the cameras that do the calculations. All right, so that's where that happens. All right, so now let me just have a look. Let's go back to our. Do I want to go back to this guy? I don't want to go back to him yet, do I? No. We'll talk about him later when we talk about ISO. Oh, hang on. Hang on, so so now I've got the pattern. So let's show you, I got a video that shows the pattern. So let's do that. It's always good to see something in motion, I think, if I can do it. So here we go. Share. Large.
Color camera. Bayer cameras rely on a predefined pattern of color filters, which overlay the pixels on the camera's imager. Calculating the RGB color for any specific pixel requires a process of interpolation, which looks at surrounding pixels to estimate the values for the two colors not captured by that pixel's filter.
So now just to be clear, what we're showing here is we're showing the calculation. So before I just showed you the raw kind of, you get a filter, you get a bunch of color separations with question marks in them where there's gaps. So here's what has to happen next. Is
the process of interpolation, which looks at surrounding pixels to estimate the values for the two colors not captured by that pixel's filter. Unfortunately, this results in an averaging of color values, making it difficult to distinguish subtle shading differences. At the same time, the considerable overlap in spectral response between red, green, and blue filters creates even greater uncertainty for some color families, leading to an overall muddiness of the color image. Now, compare this to one of JAI's 3 sensor color cameras. These cameras utilize high-quality prisms with dichroic filter coatings to split incoming light into 3 separate imagers based on spectral wavelengths. The 3 precisely aligned sensors provide a separate red, green, and blue intensity value for each pixel in the image, with no interpolation required. The result is a more precise set of values, enabling subtle color differences to be more easily detected and measured. And because the hard dichroic coatings on the prism have steep spectral response curves, they minimize color crosstalk to produce more vivid colors across the full spectral range. As an added benefit, the dichroic prism filters have higher light transmittance than Bayer filters, giving JAI's 3-sensor cameras sensitivity that is typically greater than comparable Bayer cameras. Another key difference is spatial precision. By averaging 3x3 sections of the imager, the Bayer process essentially reduces a camera's spatial resolution by a factor of 3 or more. This produces a lack of sharpness that can make it impossible to see or measure small details in the image.
Okay, so that's all that stuff is absolutely true. You can probably tell by that video that they're trying to sell you on a 3-chip camera, and there's a bunch of disadvantages to 3-chip cameras. But aside from that, all that stuff about the Bayer filter is absolutely accurate. Okay, so what you got to remember is that the a camera with a Bayer filter, a 1-chip camera from your phone to the cameras that we use on our projects, all the various cameras, they're doing a bunch of calculations to overcome those drawbacks. So when we talked a minute ago about the math, one of the reasons that the CPUs and the cameras have to get better is in order to overcome the physical disadvantages of having a Bayer filter. So you gain, you gain all kinds of things by having the filter, but then you have to trade off. Everything's a trade-off. Remember, price, speed, quality. Whatever you do in technology, there's some kind of trade-off. So yes, a 3-chip camera is a better, brighter, right? When he talked about it more like transmittance, it means it's a brighter, faster lens, faster camera, but it's bigger, bulkier. It has optical, physical elements that have to be aligned. There's all kinds of issues with the 3-chip camera. So we've kind of, as an industry, moved towards the 1-chip, and we need to then overcome those Bayer filter drawbacks with powerful CPUs in the cameras. And I think we're pretty much there. I mean, it's pretty much to the point where the 3-chip camera is not dead, because it does definitely have applications, but the 1-chip camera pretty much rules. So anyway, back to the show at hand. So let's go back to here. So back to the PowerPoint. So again, remembering on the right, we're seeing the image off the chip. On the left, we're seeing an image that's been then recalculated from that image, from that original Baird image. So then once the image is captured and created, so in other words, the process that gets us from this on the right to this on the left is called demosaicing, which is a very cumbersome word, but it's the word that it really covers what's going on with the Bayer filter. So what demosaicing is, and this is a blown up example of just a few pixels. On the left would be the image captured with a Bayer filter, and you can see it doesn't look like anything because it isn't. Remember, we're getting intensity data from the pixels with the color overlays. So you get this weird looking blocky thing, right? Now we're really zoomed in. When you demosaic it, you basically end up with the image on the right where you've averaged all these pixels, and now you're starting to see some color differentiation, some pinks, and there's some blues over here. There's some white, right? Where there's lots of green on here, that means it's mostly white because there wasn't any other color, right? And because of calculations and computations, we know it's not green. Well, the camera knows it's not green, et cetera, right? It's a fairly sophisticated process, which we don't need to get into in detail. But this is a kind of calculator that's going on every single frame of every shot you take, right? And that's the demosaic process. So how do they do it? We'll go back to our Bayer filter. This is a really small chunk of a Bayer filter. There are a bunch of different ways to calculate this. There's no one way. I'm going to just show you one method of calculating all these colors, and I'm going to give it to you at a very high level. And that is this, where we divide it up into blocks of 4, right? So 2 pixels by 2 pixels. And we average that black dot becomes the kind of the average data for that area, right? And then you overlay those 2 by 2s. So now you've got the first set up here. Then you take that same block of pixels. Remember, this all these 4 diagrams on the left are the same block of pixels we started with. First, you divide them into this section, then you divide them into these 2 sections, then these 2 sections until you have all 9 combinations that you can make, right, from these pixels. And you then take that and make this sort of grid on the right. And that is how you do your calculation. And you compare. So in one, you compare all the 1s and then all the 2s and all the 3s and the 4s. You do that one by one for each of these, and then you put them all together and then compare all that and come up with your final image. Now there's a bunch of math, but understand that it's kind of looking at neighbors, right? That's the whole point of this. It's demosaicing is called debayering when you're talking about Bayer filters, but it isn't always called debayering if you're not using a Bayer filter. There are other filters, but we're not going to get into them. Yeah, and so again, the method of debayering, for example, quad Bayer is used for HDR because you have more adjacent pixels to compare with. So understand that when we talk about HDR, it's the same number of pixels, right? You can see the black lines divide up the pixels the same way. What's changed in the quad Bayer is that now the filter has 4 pixels, a 2x2 array for each color, not just a single pixel, right? So this gives us a much higher contrast ratio for HDR. But as you can understand, you lose a bit of sharpness in doing this, right? So to get that better color and contrast, you have to give up some image sharpness. And then again, more calculations are required to return to an image, right? And then there's, like I said, there's Foveon. Fujifilm has something called X-Trans, there's EXR. There's all kinds of other filtering systems. But Bayer is by and large one of the most popular, and variations of Bayer. Oh, where'd my cursor go? There we go. So what happens, what are the results of debayering? So some of the results are depending, and so these 4 frames, you guys can see all these, right? These 4 frames are giving you 4 different debayering algorithms. So what's happening, same sensor, same filter, different math, okay? Just keep that clear. Same sensor each time, same image, actually. But what's happening, we take the image off the sensor and then we do different math to it, and you get these different results. So understand that different cameras using the same sensor, because this is very common, right? You'll find this with everything in the industry. There's only a handful of people making sensors, even though there's all kinds of people making cameras. Not everybody makes their own sensor. Why would you when there's someone making sensors wholesale? Flat screen TV, same thing, right? There's only so many companies making the panels. Let's say there's 4 or 5 in the world, but there's probably 50 to 100 different manufacturers of TVs. Same is true with cameras. So you'll have, the Sony camera will have a Sony sensor, but then another camera will have a Sony sensor. And their secret sauce is how do they make the image and how do they do the math? So here you get a bit of interference, you get kind of lines. Here you're getting kind of a color interference. Here you're getting a different sort of color interference. And then finally, again, we're getting a different kind of line interference, right? That's just a product of the different algorithms. So when you're evaluating cameras for purchase or rental, and you start getting this deep, and I'm not saying you should, but when you start getting this deep into how the camera functions, for example, if you're going to do like a Wes Anderson style film where you want lots of color and lots of contrast, then how the camera handles color is going to be important, right? You can't fix it all in post if you don't capture it all. The other thing is, so let's just go back for a second. So you're seeing these lines, so as well as the color squares and all the weirdness and the jaggies, like here's some jaggies, you're also seeing these lines that are happening. Well, those lines are called moire, M-O-I-R-E, French, pronounced moire. Okay, and moire is basically an artifact of horizontal lines and square pixels coming together, and it's unavoidable when you have fine patterns, right? And I'll show you that in a second. So let's stop share for a sec. Let's pause. I'm going to pause again. Let's share, and then have a look at this. Share, large. So this is moire in action. Now you guys can see this. Do you see that kind of weird on the sides, particularly that kind of vibrating, buzzy? And so these are false colors, by the way. So when we talk about false color in a Bayer filter, I don't know if you guys can see it. It's so hard because I'm transmitting down the internet. So you may have to look at this off the Learning Hub directly on your computer or on YouTube directly. If you can see where my cursor is, you can see these areas here where there are bands. I'll make it move. You see these banding areas? Some of you are seeing colors there that don't exist. You're seeing greens, yellows. You're seeing maybe a bit of red or blue, right? That's what's called, that's the false color I'm talking about. What's happening is the pattern in the shirt is fooling the filter into thinking that there's adjacent. So just so I'm clear, this shirt is one color against white, right? There's no other colors here, but you're seeing a bunch of colors because the Bayer filtering and the math that is doing the filtering calculation is not accurate. It is being fooled. It is creating false color. Okay, so that's the false color I'm talking about. This is really obvious and gross, but it'll appear in any kind of, in tree branches, they're waving in the wind, particularly depending on small leaves, that kind of stuff. You will get false color artifacts. Most of the time you don't care, but again, sometimes you do care, right? So, all right, so that's moire. I've got another example of moire here. Do I? No, that was it. All right. There's a great video, by the way. I got to stop sharing, of course. There's a great video that I've posted. I'm not going to run the whole thing, but because it's quite technical. But Filmmaker IQ, I'll just run a bit of it. Share. These guys do a great job of making training videos.
This Filmmaker IQ lesson is proudly sponsored by Rode Microphone.
We'll just move on.
The missing electron.
So he's going to
creates what's
talk
called
here,
a hole,
and I used to talk
a
about this in
space that
class.
attracts
I don't think
a
it's that
free
important
electron.
anymore. To get
Though
into the
p-type
mechanics of it.
and n-type carry positively charged
What
holes.
John Hess, that's John Hess there. What he's talking about is how the sensor actually works. So I won't test you on this, but it's certainly, if you want to know this kind of level of technical detail about how
So
pixels
if we connect
turn light
the
into
positive
electricity,
terminal of a
so he's going to show.
depletion layer to increase, the negatively charged p-type area now repels electrons, and the current cannot.
So he's going into the whole thing, and this, in fact, is the opposite of the process. Remember when we talked about flat screens, and I used that olive and Swiss cheese metaphor, where if you drop an olive into the Swiss cheese hole, you get light, and that's how the monitor lights up in an LED. What's happening is the exact opposite here. Light is pushing the electrons out of the holes, and you're getting electrons going down the wire, right? So if you want to get into that level of detail, by all means, he talks a bit about the filtering. I'll just skip around. So for example, you can see
exposure.
Oh, here we go.
Row by row, by alternating the current along those thin aluminum strips.
And we're going to talk about this in a second, so I won't get to that. Right, I'll actually pause that there. We're going to talk about the different sensors and how they respond. Okay, stop share. All right. Okay, so back to the slideshow. Back to the podcast. Okay. So demosaic images are not universal. What that means is that not every camera does this. Raw files are not debayed, right? So you have to do that yourself, and that's called digital developing. And that is your demosaicing, and you have more control over this. But understand, it's a very complex process. So what a lot of people just do is they output the raw file, and they simply in their editing software simply apply a filter or a LUT or a number of other steps to it automatically. And the problem with that is, unless you're doing it for a reason, there's no point in it. You know, your camera should do a good enough job of giving you a clear video image. You only want to shoot raw if you want to manipulate that base level contrast, color, right? There's a bunch of reasons to shoot raw. I'm not trying to talk you out of it, but understand you're adding extra workflow. So you don't necessarily need to do that. 3-chip cameras don't have filter arrays, so they also don't need debayering, right? They come out as complete whole images without the math. So again, 3-chip cameras don't have the computers in them, the same power that the cameras that are 1-chip, because they don't need to do that much math. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about electronic sensors types. And there's 2 main types. There's the charge coupled device, CCD, on the left, and the CMOS, complementary metal oxide semiconductor, on the right. I just said that. Typically, the 3-chip cameras, by the way, are CCDs, right? Just so you know. What this slide basically says is the 2 processes are different, and we'll talk about what they're different about. So the thing to know about a CCD camera is that it's essentially a series of layers. a CCD sensor, I'm sorry. The sensor is a series of layers. You've got the photodiodes on top, and the important thing to remember, is that all cameras start analog. All digital cameras start by taking the light and making electricity, right? That's an analog image right there on the top. After that analog image has been transferred on the CCD into the processor, it's digitized. So it's analog on the chip on CCD and then digitized off the chip. Okay. Oh, hang on. All right, there we go. The limitation with a CCD is that the pixel charge is transferred. I'll show it with a picture. I'll talk with a picture here. Here we go. The CCD has really only one path out. So this diagram shows you the chip with its filter on it, right? Still got the Bayer filter if you're using one chip CCD, right? But what was I going to say? If this was a 3-chip CCD, you'd only have one color on here. You wouldn't have 3, right? But for now, we're talking because CCD can be 1 or 3-chip. CMOS typically tend to be 1 chip. CCD, 3-chip, single chip camera. This blue stuff up here is telling the chip when the frames are happening. It's called a clock driver, and it's basically saying, okay, next frame, next frame, next frame. That's all it really does. The output's happening down here, and the photons are turned into electrons, which is turned into voltage, which is then put into another processor chip outside of the sensor chip, and it's converted to a digital image. Okay, that's the key takeaway here, is that it's off chip. The processing of the image is done what's called off chip. This is also a chip. Yes, I know it gets confusing, but the chip we're dealing with is the sensor chip. So CCDs process off chip. All right, I've got to stop because someone's in the waiting room and I can't let them in for some reason. So let me just pause. There. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to go back. Oh. So before we get to that off-chip stuff, let's go through what happens on a CCD on the chip. Photodiodes capture the photons, turn them into basically a snapshot of the image. The photodiodes sort of capture and hold the electrons in the pattern of the photons. So the photons hit this surface. There's electrons that are formed into a pattern that match the photons. It is then transferred down to what's called a transfer gate, and that just means it's kind of pushed down so the next frame can be taken. It's just clearing the photodiodes for the next frame, and then this happens one frame at a time. The entire image is then down. So let's just say frame one goes to here, frame 1 goes to here, and out. And then when frame 1's here, frame 2 is here. When frame 1's, geez, don't click. When frame 1's here, 3 is here. So frame 1 goes to frame 1, goes to frame 1. Frame 1 goes to frame 1, frame 2 starts. So then frame 1 goes to frame 1, and then frame 3 starts, right? It's a rotating process. Light comes in from the top, and the information is just shuttled to the bottom and then out. Okay. The reason it goes to these steps, and just in case you're wondering what the hell's going on here, is first we want to capture the image. Then we want to move the image off the sensor so we can capture the next frame. The third layer is basically numbering. It's called address decoding. It's basically numbering each pixel, right? It's basically taking all these pixels and assigning them a number so that when they get transferred out, because they go out in a stream of data, we now have, or a stream of electrons, we now know what they are, where they belong. And then down here, this bottom piece is what basically tells this is the triggering mechanism that says change, 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 right? This is all this is, this last layer. So that's how CCDs work. The important thing to remember is these things on the side. Images processed off chip. The whole area of the pixel is used, right? There's nothing on the top layer but pixel sensor. An analog image is created, which comes out, your video appears here as analog and is digitized on another chip. That's the CCD sauce right there. So moving on, CMOS sensors are much more complicated. You can see already that the layering is giving you a much more sophisticated situation. So first off, above the sensor, we have the micro lens. And all the micro lens is there to do is to focus the light for that pixel. So understand, this is a pixel level lens, right? Pretty sharp, pretty small. Below that is the filter. You can see the color filter sandwich layer right here. It's not labeled, but there it is. And then on top of that, we have kind of like, if you imagine, this is the same sensor area, this whole one, as the CCD, but only part of it is photodiode, the sensitive part to light. The rest of it is kind of like a little factory. These are literally circuits, right? This is literally a little processing factory on each pixel. Then below that, we have where the data is transferred off and all that kind of stuff. So the important thing to remember with the CMOS is the processing is done at the pixel, on location. The processing comes to the pixel, basically. The CCD, the processing, all the data is collected first and then it's processed later. All right. So self-contained imager in each pixel. So each individual pixel is like a camera, if you want. It's got everything in it to make the image. The downside to this is because this area is so tiny and you've got so much circuitry crowded in here, there's more potential for noise, right? So what that means is the electrons that are traveling around in here doing all this work on this image, so image hits the photodiode and then is transferred all around here, those electrons can interfere with this operation and create noise. They'll randomly land in here. They'll jump out of here because electrons are, they're silly. They just go wherever they want. And so you can get more noise, and you do. The other downside to CMOS is, as you can see, we have probably, what, a third of the area is pixel, is actual sensor. So it's physically smaller. You're going to collect fewer photons because you're in a smaller area compared to a CCD, right? The processing, however, is done right beside the sensor, right? So right in this same area. So we consider this to be on-chip processing as opposed to off-chip processing. All this processing, all the same stuff that happened with the CCD, first off, is happening right next to the pixel on that same chip, okay? The only thing that happens outside is kind of the stuff that gives it some prompts and some signals, right? And then, of course, the storage, okay? So then a quick comparison, just to show the two. The Bayer filter, again, these are both single sensor cameras, right? CCD can be single, can be triple. CMOS is typically only single. But anyway. And this basically is a technical plather of saying what I've already said, right? So I'll just leave that there for a second. I'm not going to read it all to you because I've already kind of said it. The bottom point, though, is important. One of the big pluses of a CMOS is that because each pixel is processing, is as soon as it's processed, it can offload that data. The CCD can't offload the data until the entire image is processed, right? Because it goes out as an image and it processed as an image. The CMOS goes out as a pixel and is processed as a pixel, right? So then we end up with a problem with that, however, because what CMOS does, because of its advantages, and I'll go back to my video, is you have something called rolling shutter. So let's stop that. Let's talk about that for a second. So I'm going to show the John Hess video just for 1 second, if I can show.
And send off onto a serial shift register, which is it became
He's
the
got
pixel level overcome CMOS sensor, practically all CMOS censored.
Yeah,
You can give each pixel a little.
Okay, so he says what I'm going to say, but he doesn't have pictures to show it. So I'm going to show you something else that does have pictures, which is the actual result of rolling shutter. Okay, so here is global shutter. So here's rolling shutter first. And then we'll show you global shutter. So this video I'm going to show you, share screen, is rolling shutter artifacts. So this is the downside, and you guys can test this yourselves right today. All you need to have is two things: a fast vehicle, either it's a car or a skateboard or whatever, and a phone, and something that's comes out of the ground in a like a lamppost, something that comes straight up out of the ground, okay? And then simply drive along or skateboard along or bicycle along. No, you know what? Don't recommend this, Mike. Have someone in your vehicle holding your phone, pointing at the side of the road where you have these lamp posts or fence posts, whatever they are, and then try to go by them fairly quickly while you're shooting video. And then go back and look at it frame at a time, and you'll see the distortion will happen. And this will be because all phones are CMOS cameras. You're going to see this what's called rolling shutter artifacts. So now that I've sort of built that up to this fever pitch of how fantastic this will look, let's show you what it looks like. So here's an example of rolling shutter, looking out the window of an airplane at the propeller of an airplane, all right? So first we have a high shutter speed, so we don't see, or pardon me, a low shutter speed, so we can't see the image. It's too blurry. Remember we talked about shutter speeds, right? So now we're exposing the frame for a long time, and as a result, the propeller blade gets a chance to move through the frame without being captured properly, so it's kind of blurry. But as we increase the shutter speed, you're going to start to see it'll freeze the rolling shutter artifact. So that's oh, 400. Here we are. All right. So now we're looking at 1/4 thousandth of a second. This is a regular propeller blade spinning in a circle, but look at how weird it looks. Look how distorted it is. If you look carefully at the bottom of the screen, and if I can get rid of the YouTube thing for a second, if it'll go away. Maybe not. No, because I got the cursor there. Hang on, let me move it out of the way. No, but if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that it's a traditional rotating propeller, right? Kind of attached to the airplane, but it's not bent. It is not bent. It is straight up. We'll explain this as we go here. But this is the CMOS. This is the big downfall of CMOS. And you can also, by the way, notice the first thing people say to me is, well, can't you just change the shutter speed to get rid of that, to stiffen up, the image, to get rid of that rubberiness? No, all you can do is lower the shutter speed, and it'll change so you don't see it anymore. And so now we're down at 1/30th, right? 40th, 50th. Right? So that's not objectionable. No one's going to say that's weird looking and freaky. But if you're at, 1/4000th, it just looks too weird. Okay. So that's the rolling shutter artifact that CMOS provides, if you want. We'll get into more of that in just a second. Let me just go back to the slides. Let's see where I'm at. Yes. So that's the very next thing I have a slide for. So let's show it from the slide perspective. So here we have an example of rolling shutter on the left and global shutter on the right. So what global shutter means is because the CCD captures the entire image at once and has to process at a frame at a time, every single frame is discrete like a still image. Because CMOS can and does capture image by pixels, what camera manufacturers do is they offload that image a row at a time, right? Not a pixel at a time, because that would be way too sophisticated and way more wiring. But what they do is a row or a series of rows of pixels at a time are processed. So as a result, this is why you get this weird artifact. And let's just have a look at this. So here's what happens to guitar strings, right? They look like spaghetti in the rolling shutter, right? You can see how weird they move. They're not moving like that. They're moving like they are on the right, on the global shutter. Okay, so that is the, oh, I don't want to do that again, sorry. That's something you have to be aware of, because you're gonna have to fight that when you're doing your shooting. If you've got lots of motion, if you're doing what the shot I'm talking about in a car, and you've got stuff in the background, you'll notice a lot of films when they have car shots, they avoid having vertical stuff in the background on the street, let's just say, or the green screen behind it. Right? They avoid that so that you don't see this artifact. So here's an example. Here's what's happening, just in case you're wondering what is going on. What is going on is that the CCD camera is offloading the pixels and processing them row at a time as they're ready, right? This is one frame of time, okay? This whole square. But the first row is ready, so it gets processed. The second row is ready. Well, remember that the second row is the world is moving the whole time. When we take an image, as always, the arrow of time continues to move. So no matter what you do, whether you take it a frame at a time or a line at a time, the rest of reality keeps moving forward. So the object moves forward in space during that 1/3 of a second frame, right? It moves forward in space, and as a result, the second row is a bit later than the first row. And then the third row is a bit later than the second row, and on we go, right? This is all happening within one frame. So the reason that the motion looks weird to us is because that is not a natural way to capture an image. That is not how our brain is prepared, and that is not how things look. So we get this weird undulation. We get these weird. So for example, if we were shooting, let's just say this was these bars. Let's just say these bars represent a lamppost. As you drive by the lamppost, it's going to be here, here, here. As the frame progresses, the lamppost is still moving because you're still moving in that 1/3 of a second. So the lamppost, you capture dunk, 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 and you get this weird angled lamppost. That's what I want you guys to go experiment with, is go out and shoot. You've got to be at right angles to the object. You've got to be far enough away. So you have to do it in such a way. For example, if you're doing it from a car, you don't want to get the lamppost on your side of the street. You want to get them across the street. You need enough distance to make this effect more obvious. When you get a CCD camera, it shoots the whole frame at once, like a still image in a camera. Snap, bang, there's the lamppost straight up, right? It's not moving within the frame. It's not moving within the frame in the 30th of a second. And if it is moving within the frame, the whole thing is moving together. So you get a bit of that motion blur that we're all used to. But if it's moving within the frame of a CMOS camera, you get this weird looking thing. So, and this is another video here. The airplane, an airplane, right? It looks really freaky. It looks like some kind of a substance-induced hallucination. And it kind of is. But that's because the way the camera is capturing the image, is capturing that whole propeller blade, all kinds of different times and points as the frame is being created. So you get this unnatural effect. All right. So here's another one I've got another video of this. So I'm going to end this for a second. We'll do the share of the video. Share, which is, oh, hang on, I got to open the video first. Yes. Hang on a second. This is why I wanted the other technology. Go away. Oh, there it is. Yeah, so let's do that. Where did it go? Share. Oh, there it is. This is the worst. Okay, so let's look at rolling shutter with a different object. So this is a fan, okay, as you can tell. This is not an animation. I want you to be understanding this. This is an actual fan being shot. It looks like an animation. It looks like CGI. So you can see already that that's not right. The arrows to point out to you that this is not right. This blade is distorted in the fan because it's moving through the frame as the frame is being built. So when the frame starts getting built, the blade's down here, and by the time the fan has finished moving, or the frame has finished building, the fan has moved, right? You get this weird liquid effect. You crank up the shutter speed and it doesn't fix it. It just makes it go faster. Okay. I'll just let this go for a second. Just to so you understand that you cannot fix this problem with shutter speed. Many people think you can. And all you end up with is this kind of weird blobby thing. So if you need a situation where you've got to have a fan blade moving in a shot or a propeller blade moving in a shot, you can't use a camera that does rolling shutter. You've got to have a camera that's either CMOS, right? Remember I said 3-chip cameras aren't dead? Because 3-chip cameras can do global shutter. Some of the new CMOS cameras can do it in processing in the camera, right? They can play with the pixels as they come off the sensor and realign them in time. That is now possible. It wasn't possible even a couple of years ago. But you need to have that global shutter to get a proper looking non-hallucinogenic fan blade. All right. Okay. All right, I'm going to stop there. That's a good time for a quick question break. I know. Share. Okay, so this is a very brief illustration that might help a little bit understanding what's going on with this global shutter, rolling shutter.
Practically all CMOS sensors, rolling shutter. In a CCD, image is recorded in a single instant.
Okay, so you understand what he said here. In a CCD, something moves and you freeze it, right? Whole image frozen, bit blurry on either side, right? We're used to that. That's a phenomenon we've had since the days of photography first being invented.
Also, there's a common motion artifact that plagues practically all CMOS sensors.
And by the way, he uses the term motion artifact. That's very correct. An artifact is an unwanted element in your image, right? So it's not just bits of black and bits of noise and bits of moire. Motion artifacts are also, like various blurs and such, are also considered artifacts. So keep that in mind.
Rolling shutter. In a CCD, image is recorded in a single instant. A CMOS sensor records data line by line, so the information collected at the top of the frame is slightly ahead of time from the information collected at the bottom of the frame.
Does that make sense? Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think you're the elected spokesperson, Veronica. You're the only one who seems to speak out most of the time. But so that's what I want you guys to understand. And you know, I joke a little bit, but it's harder to do this when you're not in person because I can't see any of your faces. I have no idea if you're getting this or not. But you can see that the CMOS scanner is scanning the frame. So if the top item is the actual object moving, the CCD captures it in motion. Of course, there's a bit of blur because it is moving horizontally while we're snapping it. But the CMOS, you have less blur. You'll notice that the CMOS image is sharper, but it's distorted, right?
This results in the jello effect, where fast pans look crooked, or strange patterns developing in fast-moving objects. Now, rolling shutter isn't always necessarily bad. By reading lines at different times, you can give each pixel a little bit of extra time to capture photons, resulting in better low-light performance. A rolling shutter can also be mitigated with really fast readouts, or by including a little bit of memory on each pixel that stores the voltage before being read out. Now, despite these limitations, the advantages of the CMOS sensor, from its ease of fabrication to low power draw, make it ideal for both consumer and professional level cameras.
So that's the point I want to leave it on there from that video, and I'll leave you guys to watch that at your leisure. But oh, did I just close that window? Oh no. And we'll just share the slide, put the slide up while I'm talking. So, you know, I guess what I would be careful about, and when I'm saying this, is don't think that CMOS sensors are terrible, because we seem to be focusing on all of our shortcomings. They're absolutely fantastic sensors. It's just that you have to know about what their limitations are in order to achieve what you need to achieve, right? So if you need to see those fan blades in your shot, you cannot have a rolling shutter. You will get the image on the left and not the image on the right. Okay, that jello effect. And you've all seen it, right? I mean, you saw it in the you know, the Fleetwood Mac Dreams viral video with the guy on the skateboard, and you saw everything as he's bouncing up and down the street. The whole scene kind of bounces up and down like jello. I mean, that's fine. And so, you know, I guess what's interesting about that is that's going to be one of those things that, you know, 50 years from now, when people look at video from today, and the video is full of all these bouncing, wiggling objects, it'll date the image. In the same way, when you guys look back and I look back on the past video of today, or the past video, sorry, of 50 years ago, and it's all either black and white, or it's blurry, or you've got those weird, you know, VHS tape lines going through the picture. And once again, I'm waving my hands in front of the screen. You can't see it, but you've got those VHS lines in front of the picture that dates that image to the 70s, or the, you know, so all these artifacts visually can give you atmosphere. That's my point. You can intentionally include them if, for example, you want it to look like the 2000s. You can magnify those errors, right? But if you want to capture properly, clearly, cleanly, you need to understand what you can and can't do with the sensor you're given. All right.
So, hey, you mentioned that you have to control the rolling shutters when you're shooting. So, like, is what you're saying is that, you know, you have a lot of vertical lines. Maybe you would switch to a camera that's using a CCD sensor?
So
Is that
yes,
where we're
that's a good
going here?
question. You've got two choices to make. One is avoid those elements in your picture. Don't shoot them. And a lot, if you watch movies, like go and watch films, and you'll see a lot of filmmakers, especially modern films over the last 4 or 5 years, where films are definitely digitally shot. You know, it's hard to tell when you go back for further than 5 years, because some directors were still using film. Many were shot on video, but nonetheless. So the first thing you can do is avoid the vertical element that's going to show your rolling shutter or your spinning element, your propeller. Avoid that. Second you can do is change your shutter speed if it's a moving object like an airplane propeller, so that it's just a blur, and then you don't see the blades at all. And the other thing you can do is, like you say, Veronica, change cameras. If you need to see those propeller blades, if you need to see a smooth shot of a car on a street with tall buildings that are upright and they're not bending over, because they will, if you shoot them if your camera's on top of the car and you zoom the car down the street, the buildings will appear to lean because of that global shutter or that rolling shutter, right? Well, here, in fact, this is a good point to, let me just stop the share for a second. I have another video I can show you actually of how global shutter can also cause you a bit of trouble. Where is my, there it is. If you don't have the right shutter speed. So let's have a look at, this is global shutter now. This is not rolling shutter. And this is, you know, always a good sort of gag to impress your friends. Let me just stop for 1 second. What's happening here? Why is your head exploding? Because this is, for one thing, this is impossible with rolling shutter. With rolling shutter, none of those blades would be straight, right? They would all be bent because as they're moving through the air, they would bend with the camera sensor. So this is global shutter. We know that because everything that's spinning is straight. But also what someone has done is they synchronize the shutter speed with the frequency of the blade rotation. And you can do that in global shutter and you get this result, which is quite anyway, enough of that. The video's posted. You guys can have a look at it later. But so that's a downside to global shutter, because you can get some of these unnatural artifacts. Here, hang on. Let's close that for a second. Let me say this, that there you go. Oh, dang it, hang on. I'm messing around with my screen. Where was I going with this? Oh, so how does that apply to you? Why do you care about that helicopter blade thing? Well, because there's a very simple thing that happens, and you see it quite often in some videos. Car wheels, global shutter, too high a shutter speed, and the car wheels don't look like they're spinning. Or you've got the shutter speed in such a way that they look like they're spinning backwards. Again, a cool effect if that's what you want, but you've got to be careful if that's not what you want, because you know what'll happen? People will just stare at the car wheels and go, hey, those spokes aren't turning, because the car's moving, the wheel's turning, but you've picked the right shutter speed, not the right shutter speed, but you picked the shutter speed that matches the rotation of the wheels, and now your wheels are looking like they're weird, right? So global shutter isn't without its faults, but the artifacts are different, and they're not necessarily as objectionable. They're just more like freaky than the global shutter ones are, although the global ones can be kind of freaky too. Okay, so yes, I guess the short answer to the question, if you really need to have the global shutter, your camera has to have it. It doesn't have to be a 3-chip camera. I guess to answer your question, Veronica, it doesn't need to be a 3-chip camera, but it has to be a camera. There has to be a CMOS, a modern, very recent CMOS camera with a global shutter setting. And even then, that global shutter setting might be playing tricks. You may want to test it before you guarantee. All right, so moving back to business at hand. Other issues. So we talked about moire. So moire is not just a shutter speed CMOS CCD issue. It's also involves the size of the sensor. The smaller the sensor, the more likely you're going to have moire, right? So we talked about moire already, but it is an issue that you're going to see. And I'll just to refresh you what it looks like. Way back. Here we go. This is moire. This is moire here. These weird patterns, right? And they are a result of, the bottom line is, what is moire really caused by? It's caused by straight lines in reality interfering with the straight lines on the pixel. And those straight lines are the straight lines of the filter, of the pixels themselves, because they're oriented in straight lines. So moire is somewhat unavoidable from the nature of the camera. All you can do to prevent it is You can not wear patterns on clothing. This is why we always tell people who are acting in things or who are presenting on television, don't wear fine patterns, right? Because you'll get these weird things. Wear big prints. That's why you notice that people on television seem to wear big prints, big patterns. They're told to. Jewelry does the same thing. Fine jewelry, if you have a lot of small stones on a necklace around the neck, you'll get these weird patterns. So moving back to moire. Yeah, and basically all I'm saying here is there's no such thing as a perfect sensor, right? Just understand that they all have their weaknesses. It's how noticeable are they? Price, speed, quality, right? Right back to that. How much do you want to spend on a sensor? You want the best one? It's going to cost you the most money. What every sensor has, though, is something called an optical low-pass filter. So this is one way to cheat and get rid of the moire. This is an example of a red camera's filter. It can be removed, but it's typically left in the camera. It's inside the camera. And what it does is it basically is a very, very fine blur. Okay. So here's the thing. Here's a trick you can do in editing. If you've got a lot of objectionable moire, you can apply a Gaussian blur in post, either to the whole image, or if you want to get really fancy, you could do a mask and do it to part of the image and do it at like 0.1. The lowest setting on the Gaussian blur, just the slightest blur. And what that blur does, and what this is doing here physically, is it smudges the straight lines coming in from the world as they hit the sensor. It adds a bit of a smudge, and that smudge is enough to take some of that moire away, right? So this is called an optical low pass filter. It's just basically just a blur filter, gets rid of moire. As I say, most cameras have it. Not all cameras have it. So bottom line, final notes, many complex issues in choosing the right camera. There's lenses and resolution. The sensor is just one aspect, so don't focus on this too much, but just make sure you do your research if you're going to buy and rent. Get the right tool for the right job. This goes back to the global shutter, rolling shutter. I always want to tell you guys the sign of a professional is that you know your tools, right? The reason that you've been hired for a job is you know your job. The person hiring you doesn't know your job, or shouldn't be interfering with your job, and make sure that you are the one who knows, and so be the knowing one, and they're going to have confidence in you. If you don't know, if you come in and you ask, I won't say the wrong questions, but improper questions that you as a professional should know, that's going to make people wonder if you're in fact the person you say you are, right? So make sure if you're going to come in as a camera person, the audio person, the script assistant, that you know your job well enough to at least get yourself started. And finally, beware of hype. And this is just a piece of advice when it comes to buying cameras, any gear, really. They're going to tell you all kinds of stuff. That video we saw earlier about the 3CCD camera with the Bayer filter, they're trying to sell you they're trying to sell you a 3-chip camera. And on its surface, you might watch that video and go, you know what? They're right. These single chip CMOS cameras suck. And as a result, I'm not going to buy them. I'm going to try and find a 3-chip camera. No. Do your research. Beware of hype. Salespeople will try to just sell you the object. And nowadays, especially, it's worse because oftentimes you're selling it through Amazon, you're buying it through Amazon or other online sources, and you have no idea. The people rating it will rave all about it. Those first 5 or 6 people could be paid by the company. You have no idea, right? You just don't know. They could be relatives. I mean, how many times have you bought a thing or gone to a place and they've got your contact information? The next thing you do is you get an email saying, hey, could you say some fantastic things about our place? Right? So just be careful about the hype. All right. So that's that slide part, or that's part 1.